listen on gallery view. So, and you are recording.
Yeah, I'm just going to double check and make sure it's set to be automatically recording, and yes, it is. So we're good to go, and I see people are joining us. So welcome everybody. Glad you're here.
Numbers are going up in a hurry.
It's all good. It's a little chilly tonight. It's a chilly day, actually.
It's going to get cold over the weekend.
Yeah. Did you say earlier there was something about snow coming up on Monday and Tuesday?
Monday night into Tuesday, they're talking.
Okay. Oh,
they weren't sure. It depends on the track of the storm.
Okay. Got it. Got it. Again, welcome everybody for joining us. We'll get started in a few minutes. And there's our famous kitty cat. See, everybody thought Kieran was actually giving this presentation. It's actually, what's your cat's name?
His name is Meownold Schwarzenperr.
I'm sorry I asked. Actually, yeah. I'm glad I asked. Yes. I love it. What's his short name? Because everybody has cats have more than one name.
I usually just call him Meownold, but or I just say Sir.
Sir. Okay. Yeah, sir. Yes. To earn his respect, of course.
Yeah.
I love it.
I also occasionally just call him my son. So.
Aww. Sweet.
Depends on how he's behaving.
Understood. Yes. Yeah. Very cute. Yeah.
He might not visit us today. He's just sleeping here on me. So
keeping your lap warm.
Yeah. Keeping my legs falling asleep.
It's perfect.
Keep you warm.
Yeah, work from home. We've got quite a routine going now.
Yeah. They're going to miss you when you have to go back into the office like on a regular. That's not going to, they're going to need you. You might need to hire like a pet sitter or something just to come in to give them their lap or something.
I think I just need to set up a heating pad with like a pair of pants on top.
That would work. Yes, because really, what do they do all day?
Honestly, sleep. I'll just put my like dirty laundry hamper here, and they'll just that's probably all they'll want. They'll just go to sleep.
Very cute.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Hi, Crystal. Crystal said hello. Hello back. It's about 7:01, so maybe another minute to let people jump on and we'll get started.
Sounds great.
Okay. Again, welcome everybody for joining on. We'll be getting started in a second. We're glad you're all here.
My monitors are being strange. Do this and hope that my computer doesn't get wonky.
Yeah, I was in a webinar yesterday and all of a sudden my computer went blank. Fortunately, I had my second one here, so I just turned on the second one. And then the first one came back, but anyway. So I learned from that.
Yeah, but notice my second, you can't really see it, second laptop's on the other side of the desk, so we've got a backup plan if need be.
Yeah, we don't.
Mine as well, but fingers crossed we'll be fine.
Christine is on. Hello, Christine.
For those that put any Q&As or information in the chat, I'll be addressing that momentarily. Just going to get through the quick introductory slides, and then I'll get to your questions or in a moment. I saw Sue, you raised your hand. I'll be with you shortly. So Kieran, you tell me when you're ready to rock and roll here.
I'm ready whenever.
Okay.
The cat even got off my lap, so.
Oh, wow. Okay. Hopefully he'll be back.
My mobility has been restored.
There you go. So Andy, What do you say we get
Let's go.
get going
Yep.
with backyard forestry?
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. So let me make a note here. 241. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of Backyard Forestry in 90 Minutes. I think you're going to enjoy this session like we have others. I'm Andy Kim, President of Forestry Association, and we have with us Lori Jensen, who is the Executive Director of the Forestry Association, and Kieran Hunt, who is going to be our presenter tonight and also a Director of the New Jersey Forestry Association. So with that, let's move right along. New Jersey Forestry Association, for those of you who may not know, we are a nonprofit tax exempt organization. We are 1975 to now, we're approaching 50 years, and we have traditionally been the voice of woodland owners in New Jersey, representing them in a variety of places, including the halls of Trenton. We do have a set of officers and directors. You may flip down this list and you'll see people you may know, and there will be obviously some of these people are going to be participating as members tonight. The presenters, of course, Kieran is on there as one of the presenters, and Lori and I are on there. So one of the things we do is we do represent primarily woodland owners, but other people as well. And you can see all the different organizations that we are involved with. New Jersey Forest Service, of course, is very important. Division of Taxation Farmland Assessment Committee is a group that I sit on, which is, of course, very important to woodland owners. And then there are a number of other organizations you can see there that we do have alliances with and work with to help, again, promote the interests of woodland owners and people who are interested in good forest stewardship. If you are a member of the New Jersey Forestry Association, we do have a quarterly newsletter. We have our website. We have an annual meeting, which is coming up not too far long from now. We have been doing a New Jersey Woodland Stewards Program, which is a 3.5-day program. Unfortunately, we were not able to do it in 2020 because of the pandemic, but we hope to get it back again in 2021. I like to call that Forestry 101 for adults. The Backyard Forestry in 90 Minutes, of course, is this series of presentations that we're doing. We do represent landowners in taxation and other places, and we do monitor legislation that is of importance to woodland owners. So we also have things that are of interest to non-woodland owners. Benefits, of course, things that we work on are fresh air, clean water, recreation, wildlife habitat, forestry education, and of course, Backyard Forestry in 90 Minutes, as well as the Woodland Stewards Program, which are things that are open to people who may not necessarily be woodland owners. So we do provide a lot of interesting topics for people who are not necessarily woodland owners, but are interested. So we do encourage people to join the Forestry Association. It's only $55. So if you enjoy these presentations that we're doing once a month, we certainly encourage you to join. One of the things we will mention also is that if you're a student, we do have a student category on the membership list. So if you go to NewJerseyForestry.org, there is information there on becoming a member. And we do encourage people, if you're interested in forestry, forest-related topics, forest stewardship, we do encourage you to become a member. The dues that you pay, the $55, does go to being able to put on this kind of presentation. So we do encourage people to become members so that we can continue to do these things, to provide information as well as support from things like the legislature and whatever that we need to keep tabs on. So some upcoming things, we do have the online Backyard Forestry the third Thursday of each month. So stay tuned for what the topic will be in February. The other big thing is March 20th. It's a Saturday. We will have our New Jersey Forestry Association annual member meeting. This year, it will be an online meeting. We typically have tried to do it in person in the past, but again, with the COVID situation, we are doing that, going to be an online situation in the morning. You do have to be a member of the New Jersey Forestry Association to attend that meeting. So if that's something you do want to take part in, as we said earlier, you will have to become a member to take part in that meeting on March 20th. So without further ado, we do have with us again tonight Kieran Hunt. For those of you who saw the previous presentation in December, Kieran did a great job, and what we were calling that was Winter Tree ID Part 1, because the response was so terrific that we asked Kieran to come back and do a follow-up to that. And I will say that the response we have gotten with people interested in and seeing this presentation, this is the best response we have had from people to our presentations, and we thank you for attending. And I think you're going to enjoy Kieran's presentation. So with that, take it away, Kieran.
All right, thank you, Andy. And get my slideshow up here. All right. This slideshow is huge again, so hopefully it doesn't crash my computer. All right, you can see this, right? We're good?
We're good.
All righty. So thank you again. And I want to say really thank you to everybody who attended last month, and all the enthusiasm that you showed. I'm grateful to be on here to go into the deep tracks of my tree slides, because I've had these slides for years. I've just been sort of adding to them, figuring it's a good repository, and now I finally get to show them to somebody, and it turns out I get to show them to a lot of people because a lot of people signed up for tonight. So here we go, Winter Tree ID Part 2. So once again, I'll introduce myself. My name is Kieran Hunt. I'm an ISA certified arborist, utility specialist, and a New Jersey licensed tree expert, and I'm the manager of municipal services for Asplund's Technical Services Department. And I got my bachelor's from Rutgers in ecology. And that is once again, that is a photo of the moment of my birth. So I'm going to go through really quickly. Oh, here we go already. Cat trying to walk on my computer. Sorry. I will go through really quickly some of the stuff that we went over in a lot of detail last month, because I don't want to spend half the talk going over this again. I also don't want to make it so that the people who weren't on last month don't get a little bit of introductory information. So we're going to go through this like an abbreviated version from last month. And here's my cat as a devil. That's his punishment for interrupting my talk again. He can't help himself. I apologize. All right. So tree characters. Characters are characteristics or features that help us to identify a tree. So it could be the shape, could be a color, could be a texture, could be a pattern on the bark, could be the leaf shape, could be what fall color it displays. Any of that stuff that's unique to a species is something we can use to identify it. We would call that a character. Generally speaking, we need several characters to come to an identification down to the species level. Oftentimes we can use fewer characters to get to the genus, which is less specific than species. And generally speaking, not all the characters are present, right? Like we don't see the flowers on a tree, but for maybe a week or two during the springtime. So, and in winter, obviously we're missing all the leaves from our deciduous trees, right? Deciduous trees lose their leaves in the fall and are bare through the winter for the most part. So we have to learn how to identify these trees without all the characters present, which means we have to learn more characters than are present at any one given time. And then that way, as we get to know these species, and as we become more familiar with them, as we revisit these trees over and over again throughout the year, we start to be able to pick up more nuances, and it starts to become like recognizing a person, right? When you see somebody from far away, if it's somebody you're familiar with, even though you can't make out their face that well, you might recognize their body language. You might recognize the way that they walk, their hair color. Somebody who you know intimately, you might be able to tell from behind, from a distance, that that's that person. Somebody who you just met, you might not recognize them until they're right in front of you. So we want to try to get to the point where we recognize these trees as we're approaching them before we get all the way in their face, right? So I'm not going to go through in too much detail what all these different characters are, but we're going to go briefly through these different categories of characters. And these are what I use to identify trees. So I start off with being aware of the ecology of the environment that I am in. So if I know that I'm in a lowland, I'm near water, it's wet, maybe there's some mud on the ground, maybe there's pooling water. If I know that I'm in a wetland, then I'm going to expect to find species that are adapted to wetland environments. And if I'm in an upland, if I'm on a rocky outcropping, if I know that I've hiked up into, you know, some upland areas, I'm going to expect to see species that maybe like things to be a little bit drier. And I also am paying attention to slope and aspect. Am I on the southwest facing side of a slope, or am I on the northeastern facing side? Since the southwest gets that good afternoon sun, that has an effect on what species are most competitive. Is the tree growing in the shade, or is it up at the top of the canopy? All this stuff has an impact on which species are most likely to be there. We also need to know some of the history, right? A tree can be there because somebody planted it. So we need to be just paying attention to where we are and, you know, the ecology, the history, because that's going to have an impact on what trees are likely to be growing there. Habit and form is the shape, general structure of the tree. That's also including the angles that the branches form when they come off of the main stem, and whether or not the tree maintains its lower branches because they're shade tolerant, or if it drops those lower branches as it gets up into the canopy because it's shade intolerant. And we'll go into that in more detail later. Bark is my #1 ID character in the winter, and really throughout the year, bark is constantly useful. Bark is always accessible to me. The tree is always rooted in the ground, so there's always bark that is accessible to me to touch, to come right up to. It's never, you know, there's never bark floating up in the air and none at the ground, right? Whereas twigs and leaves and everything else, pretty much any other thing on a tree other than the root flare, there's a potential for it to be way up over my head where I can't see it. So bark, while it is not necessarily natural for me to identify things based upon their texture and like the orientation, you know, as humans, I think we're a lot more inclined to identify trees based upon leaf shape, because we grow up drawing stars and circles and rectangles, and shapes from an early age are like a really useful character for us to identify things. We learn to name shapes from a very young age. So when we learn trees based upon the shape of the leaf, it's intuitive, it's natural, it's convenient. But bark is texture and color and like contrast. So it's not just one color, it's the differences between the different colors on the same tree. And that stuff's not natural. It wasn't natural for me to pick up. It took me a while. And at the end, we'll talk about some ways that you can continue your study of bark, but we're going to go into bark a lot today because I think it's essential to be able to identify trees based upon their bark, or at least become comfortable with bark as an identification character, because in wintertime, bark is your best friend. And then branch arrangement, branch density, these have an indication of leaf size and weight. They're useful also as a texture, because it's not always available to us at the ground level. We sometimes have to look up and see how they silhouette against the sky. And then some of these other characters at the bottom here, twig, fruit, leaves, these are things that probably aren't present or readily available to us in the wintertime. Even twigs, which are on the tree in the winter, are often not accessible because they're out of reach. And twig characters like bud scales and pubescence, like the fine hairs growing on a twig or a bud, and the color of the new growth, that's stuff that we can't look at unless we can get the twig in our hand. So a lot of times these three characters aren't available to us in the winter, but occasionally they are, and when they are, we can use them. So habit or form, the general shape that the tree takes. This can also involve the architecture of the tree. How is it put together? Does it grow straight as a pin, or is it very serpentine? How do the scaffold limbs attach to the main stem? How do the subsequent child branches attach to that scaffold limb, and so on? And it can depend a lot on where the tree is growing. A tree growing in the shade is going to tend to look different than a tree growing out in the open sun. Trees growing in competition in the woods tend to grow a lot more tall and narrow, and trees growing out in the field tend to grow a lot more wide than they are tall, because they have this space to grow. So I'm not going to go through a bunch of examples now. I'm just going to say that here is a sort of a small sampling of some different habits that we can find in the woods, right? We've got tulip tree, which tends to grow very straight and tall, and to only have its leaves and small twigs and branches up in the upper canopy because it's very shade intolerant. So it doesn't hang on to those lower branches in the shade, right? Silver maple or any other wetland species, many of them will tend to grow with a multi-stemmed form, this kind of vase shape or fountain shape. And if they have the available space, they can tend to grow wider than they are tall. Trees that are very phototropic or tend to grow towards the sunlight, like black cherry or sassafras, these will tend to grow very serpentine because they're constantly changing the direction of growth based upon where the available light is in the canopy. Trees like hickory, that will tend to grow in sort of an oval shape. You know, you're looking at these, the angles that the branches take as they come off the main scaffold limbs, and even as the scaffold limbs come off of the main stem. We're also paying attention to where we lose the main stem, right? This hickory tree, or sorry, this tulip tree maintained its main stem all the way up to like the last, like maybe 25% of the tree. Whereas this hickory lost its main stem early on, and it broke up into many scaffold limbs that no longer has a main stem. So the difference between, say, this hickory tree and what this was a pin oak here, there's names for these. This is called decurrent growth, where we lose that main stem and grow with many scaffold limbs, many main leads growing up and forming our canopy. And this is an excurrent growth habit, which means we retain the central lead and all of our scaffold limbs and child branches grow off of that main central stem. Okay, decurrent and excurrent. Oh, and our little lollipop tree. Bark, once again, this is very, very useful as an identification character, but takes some practice. So we're going to go through a lot of bark texture today. You know, this is going to be very dense because we're going to mostly focus on species, and I'm going to go through a lot of bark, but I'm going to give you just one example of, you know, some bark comparisons here. This is, again, if you were on last month, you'll recognize this. So just to kind of give you a brief primer on bark, if you weren't on last month, if you're not comfortable with identifying trees based upon bark, if this all looks the same to you, that's normal. Some of the things that I look at on these pictures, so we'll start from the top left. This is an ash tree. Ash tends to form a vertical structure, right? The bark is oriented up and down, right? Not side to side. So it's a vertical orientation, and it tends to form these diagonal checks or diagonal connections between these plateaus on the bark that connect them, and they form almost like a diamond pattern here. So if we look through, we can find a lot of these sort of diamond shapes in the bark. I like to talk about this as though we were little bugs walking along the bark. So if this was like a big landscape and we were a little ant walking across here, we would have a lot of really flat plateaus and then a sharp angle that goes into these cliffs or valleys. And then we'd be climbing back up to the top, hit another sharp angle, and we'd be back on a flat plateau here. And that would continue around the whole circumference of the tree, right? And if we look at this hickory tree, this next one on the list, it's got a similar pattern, right? We've got vertical structure. We're forming a bit of that diamond shape again. We've got these diagonal connections between the plates here. But we do see a little bit of a difference in the finer structure. So whereas the ash tree tends to form these flat plateaus, the hickory tree has this papery, almost like a potato chip type top layer that seems to be ready to exfoliate or like flake off. And you can even see in some areas it looks like it has flaked off, and we're left with some of the inner bark here, right? So we've lost some of the outer structure. You can see really well here that there's like a deeper spot there, and then you have that outer bark that's still retained on either side of it. So we have the same vertical structure with diagonal connections forming these diamond patterns, but we're seeing a little bit more of a layering in the bark. And if we were that little bug walking across the bark landscape, maybe we wouldn't have quite such an angular drop into these little valleys. And it is very dark in there, so we're also paying attention to the color. And I'm seeing a lot of just grays, you know, from sort of like a slate gray down to a black. Whereas on the ash tree, I was seeing a lot more browns. So these little valleys here aren't quite as deep as they were on the ash tree. They're just a darker color. So if we're that little bug walking across, it's kind of easier to climb down into the valley and get back up again and move across the circumference of this tree, right? And then these two. So on the right here, we have a red oak, and on the left, we have black gum. Okay, so upon initial inspection, they do also have very similar textures to each other. But if we're thinking like that little bug walking across the landscape of the bark here, we're going to have some pretty gentle rolling hills, right, on the oak tree here. We don't have a whole lot of steep cliffs. We don't have any like flat plateaus on top. We just have this nice curving landscape, pretty gentle, easy to navigate across if we're a little ant walking across this bark, right? Whereas if we're on this black gum here, it's a different story. This is like the Badlands of Utah, right? We're on the top of a plateau here, and then we're going down a cliff into a very deep fissure here, and then coming back up again. You know, we got to like climb back up to the top to get to this plateau again. So I just want to point out here again, we have a very similar overall texture in that they're both vertically oriented. They don't have any of this diagonal connection thing going on. It's kind of just like a blocky vertical texture. But the oak tree has a lot more brown than the black gum, and the oak tree maintains a lot more connection between its outer bark layers, whereas these are all broken up into these, you know, like these like Badlands style rocky plateaus that we see here on the black gum. And the black gum is all grays, right? Just gray to black, no brown. So there's your primer on bark. We're going to keep going into bark as we move on here, but that'll be it for now. Branch arrangement is probably the second in my branch arrangement is one of the first things that I latched onto when I was learning tree ID because it's simple. Trees in New Jersey generally either grow with opposite branching or alternate branching. There's very little of anything else in the state, and it's pretty easy to see. But as we get into more of this ID, we start to see more and more that this is sort of like, we can use this to rule things out. But generally speaking, I don't use this much because I'm looking at the bark, I'm looking at the patterns of the branches on the sky. I'm not necessarily paying much attention to branch arrangement anymore unless I'm stumped. Then I go back to the basics. I say, okay, is it opposite or alternate? And I start from there. So alternate branching means that at any one node or where a child branch comes off of a parent stem, okay? So if this is our parent stem here growing, and then we have, it's producing little offshoots or little child branches coming off of that main stem. At any given intersection here, we only have one child branch coming off, all right? They alternate from left to right, right? Alternate, or from bottom to top. Okay, and this is true also of buds. So it doesn't have to be a branch, it could just be a bud, right? There's only one here. Whereas opposite branching, we have two child branches growing off of the parent branch opposite each other. And the same is true of buds, right? Two buds growing opposite each other off of the main stem here. So alternate branching, the branches alternate left to right, top to bottom. Opposite branching, they're growing opposite each other, or there's buds growing opposite each other. In the growing season, this also means that leaves will grow opposite each other. Something I want you all to just keep in mind with this is that opposite branching is only as good as the twigs are at staying on the tree. So say this was a maple tree, which grows with opposite branching, and a squirrel was running around in the tree and knocked off half of these twigs. Suddenly it'll look alternate because we lost some of these twigs, right? And this happens just from trees blowing in the wind and branches kind of hitting each other and snapping each other off. So it can be tough to see this, especially when the twigs are 1/8 of an inch in diameter and 75 feet over your head. So if you're looking for this, you got to really look, because sometimes an opposite branched tree will look alternate upon first inspection until you get a really close look and really start looking at the finer details. You got to kind of seek out those areas where there's that opposite branching. And likewise, sometimes trees with alternate branching can have little quirky spots where two twigs will be growing just barely not together, but it looks like they're basically opposite each other, and it can trick you. I've seen this in pin oak especially, and some other oak trees. They can be a little tricky. So this is very useful because if we can determine if a tree is opposite or alternate branched, it rules out a whole bunch of other trees. But we got to be careful and make sure that we're getting a good look. If the tree's only got twigs up high in the canopy, we got to get a good look, maybe bring binoculars, or, you know, there's a chance that we'll not be able to tell. Just for the sake of being thorough, I want to mention that there are 2 others that occur in New Jersey. Whorled branching means that there are more than 2 branches or leaves coming off at a node or at an intersection here. So it's kind of going around like the spokes of a wheel. And so they call that whorled, like circular. And sub-opposite is very similar to opposite branching, except that instead of being directly opposite each other, they're just a little bit offset, okay? This is a separate category from opposite branching. All right, branch density and thickness. This is the other one that I find to be very, very useful in the winter time. This tells me a lot about a tree that I can't, that normally I wouldn't be able to see unless there were leaves on the tree. So it tells me, it can generally tell me the leaf weight, or roughly whether or not the tree has large, heavy leaves or dainty, light leaves. Because branches will tend to be thicker and stouter if they need to bear the weight of a heavy, large leaf, right? If you have a tiny little, you know, less than an 1/8 inch diameter twig, it's probably not going to be holding a 1 foot long leaf, because that leaf would be so heavy it would break the twig. So just as an example, if we had leaves and we were comparing a maple to a hickory, maples have simple leaves and hickories have compound leaves. Now, there are some maples that have compound leaves, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to focus on this comparison right now. So red maple has a simple leaf. So this is 1 leaf. Each red circle is encompassing a single leaf. So the maple is a simple one. We have 1 blade, and then we have what's called a petiole connecting that blade to the twig. All right, here's the woody twig here where the leaf grew off of. That is 1 leaf. Whereas here, a compound leaf has multiple leaflets. So in this case, we have 5 blades as opposed to the 1 on the red maple, right? We have 5 blades. These all are part of the same leaf. We have this central stem that's called a rachis. It's basically the equivalent of the petiole on the red maple. This rachis is the central axis from which all the leaflets grow, and it's also the stem which connects that leaf back to the parent branch. So this is 1 leaf. And if you'll see my hand in here for comparison, this is why I sized these pictures this way. I tried to make it an apples to apples comparison by using my hand as the, you know, the meter stick. So this is about how they compare size-wise in real life. The hickory leaf is a whole lot bigger and it's a whole lot heavier. And so these are the same 2 plants, the red maple on the left, the hickory on the right, and roughly equivalent scale. So you see the hickory branch is much thicker and stouter because it has to bear the weight of that large leaf. Whereas that red maple twig is very thin, very narrow. And in this case, red maple is opposite branched. So you see these 2 buds opposite each other and down here. And hickory is alternate branched. So we're seeing one here, one over here. We can compare these 2 buds that are alternating here. So just a little aside there. And then when we're looking up into the winter sky and seeing the canopy without its leaves, we're looking at not only how thin and dainty the twigs look, but how numerous they are. So now we're talking about density in terms of the number of twigs. So in this case, there would be like a dense population of twigs up in the canopy. There's not a whole lot of space for leaves to grow. And that's because there are very small leaves on that tree. So come the springtime, those little gaps in the canopy are going to be filled up with relatively small leaves. Whereas on the hickory tree, we have a lot more empty space, a lot more negative space. We can see a lot more sky through the branches. And so we expect that there's going to be large, heavy leaves coming out in the springtime to fill in those larger gaps. So that rachis, that central stem on the hickory leaf that was connecting all those leaflets back to the parent branch, that's like another twig, right? That's almost like an extra twig that comes out and helps to fill in some of the empty space. And then the photosynthetic material, those blades on the leaves that actually do the hard work of photosynthesizing, those come out of that rachis. So when you compare the 2, again, this is roughly to scale in comparison to each other. With a small leaf, we have a lot less sky visible through the canopy. We have a lot smaller gaps in the canopy for leaves to grow into, and we have much daintier, much thinner twigs. That's a little hard to see on the picture, I know. But in person, this was a little easier to see. It was easier to tell that that hickory tree on the right had thicker, more stout twigs to bear the weight of those large leaves. As a side note, I just want to mention that trees that are unhealthy tend to have fewer twigs, right? So when a tree is experiencing some kind of stressor that affects its health, I would expect it to produce fewer twigs or to produce less growth on each individual twig and to tend to look sparser in the canopy. So even in the growing season, you'd be able to generally see more sky through an unhealthy tree because it has fewer leaves. It's just not doing as well. It doesn't have as much energy to produce all that photosynthetic material. Whereas a healthy, vigorous tree will tend to have less sky visible through it. It'll tend to be a denser canopy and a fuller canopy. So that translates in the wintertime to how full the twig density is. So this is a good comparison between two healthy trees. We had a healthy red maple on the left, a healthy hickory tree on the right. But just know that there is some variation here depending on the health of the tree and the growing conditions. So again, here's our list of winter characters with the 4 that we're going to focus on today highlighted: habit, form, the general shape of the tree, the bark texture, orientation, color, branch arrangement, whether it's opposite or alternate, and then branch density and thickness. So are they bearing large, heavy leaves? What does it look like against the winter sky? Here are the species we're going to focus on today. Don't get your hopes up. We're probably not going to get through this list. And I want to stop early so that we have time for questions. I can always start this, pick up the slides again if we run out of questions, but I don't expect to run out of questions. So we're actually going to pick up where we left off last month. So we stopped on white oak, but for the sake of thoroughness, because we're going through a lot of oaks today, we're going to go through white oak one more time. So I apologize if you're seeing this for the second time, but I'll try to get through it quickly. White oak is one of the largest, oldest lived trees that grows native to New Jersey. It grows in that sort of like picturesque, standard regal oak growth form. So in maturity, with the space to grow, in this case, this tree had some canopy, some space in the canopy to grow wide. It can grow to be a very regal, very impressive looking tree. So white oak, some of the oldest trees that have been documented in the state of New Jersey were white oaks. And you can see up through the canopy here. So this is a good example of what I was just talking about with a tree that's stressed out, having more sky visible through it. So white oak has simple leaves, okay? The leaves aren't super big. They are bigger than that red maple, but they're not as big as the hickory. But we're seeing a lot of sky through this tree, and that's because this is an over-mature tree. It's got some stress. It's sort of reaching its older age. It's not necessarily in bad condition. It's just not growing very quickly. This is an old guy. So he's just sort of plodding along, putting on a little bit of growth every year, just getting by. And that tree could sit there like that for another, 50 years or more. But so that's why we're seeing a lot of these gaps in the canopy. Here's another white oak tree. This gives us a little bit more of an indication of the bark characters. So I want you to pay attention, if we're talking about habit or form, I want you to pay attention to how serpentine a lot of these branches are. If we look back at this one and we're looking at this new one here, we lost our main central lead, right? We don't have that center lead going straight through to the top of the canopy. So this would be considered decurrent. Okay, it has many scaffold limbs forming the main canopy architecture. And then off of those scaffold limbs, these sort of main architectural branches, we have many, many smaller and smaller subsequent branches finally growing out to our small twigs that bear the leaves and the fruit. But we're seeing a lot of angularity. This tree tends, especially as it gets older and kind of stagnates there, we tend to be able to see a lot of this sort of serpentine, twisted look to the way that the branches grow out. That's part of what gives it that regal structure, in my opinion. One bark character that you'll notice on some white oak trees is actually a disease. This is called smooth patch syndrome. As far as I can tell, it's relatively superficial. It doesn't really seem to affect the health of the tree very much, but it's basically, from what I understand, and I don't know this for a fact, I've heard that it's a fungal thing that just erodes some of the outer bark. So basically you end up with these smooth patches. And this is actually a useful identification character because no other oaks in the state exhibit this smooth patch disease. I think that I may have seen it once on a post oak, which is closely related to white oak. But generally speaking, if you see smooth patch disease, that means that it's a white oak. Now here's an oak without that smooth patch disease, and this is a great example of how oak tree bark changes as the stems get more mature. So generally speaking, any tree's bark is going to be different on a young stem compared to a medium-aged stem compared to an old stem. As the tree grows larger, that growth tissue under the bark, the cambium, produces the new live wood that conducts the sugars up into the tree and back down again, and the water up into the tree. And then we have a cork cambium in the outside that produces the bark as well, and it's producing it in layers. And as the tree gets older, that layering tends to have an effect on the outer texture and the look of the bark. So in this case, white oak on medium-aged stems tends to form this shingle look. To me, this is a really, really useful ID character for white oak. So it's vertically oriented bark, very gray, relatively light colored, right? We don't see a lot of that black that we were seeing in like the hickory or the black gum. But if you look, when you see these parts of the stem that we're seeing just in profile, the very edge of the stem here, we can see under these layers of bark into that shadowed area. And that's like, you know, if you take a book and you kind of curl it and start and like kind of look under the pages, or if you're looking at the shingles of a house, if they're not quite flat, if they're kind of lifted a little bit, you see under there a little bit. That character is really useful for identifying oak. Generally, if you're seeing a mature tree, you'll see this on the scaffold limbs coming out horizontally from the main stem. You'll look up and you'll see that right on those edges, right? Because we're seeing that underside of the bark and it has that shingly appearance. Here's where that shingly appearance gives way to some of the more mature bark characters where it starts to become just vertically oriented and blocky, but it does kind of maintain this same color. This is a white oak tree that I saw in the woods this year, or I guess last year. I just want to point out how clear you can see the smooth patch disease, even from a distance, right? And look at how light colored that bark is compared to all the other species around it in the woods here. So it's not always quite this stark, but sometimes it is. And this is it's a white oak, right? And it looks pretty white compared to all the other trees around it. Okay, that's white oak. Post oak, again, I said this was closely related. But the difference is that post oak in New Jersey tends to grow in the pinelands. It's you won't generally find this in our typical like northern hardwoods forest. You'll tend to find this exclusively in the pine barrens and surrounding areas. So it is in the white oak group. Just as an aside, oak trees in New Jersey tend to fall into one of two categories: the white oaks and the red oaks or the black oaks. The white oak leaves have rounded lobes. So if you were to see them in the growing season, they don't have any teeth. They don't have any sharp points. They are just rounded and soft and cloud-like in profile. Whereas the black oaks or the red oaks, that's the same group, they all have teeth at the ends of the lobes. So it'll be more of, there'll be sharp teeth, and a lot of times it'll be a lot more of an angular looking leaf. So post oak and white oak are both in the white oak group. They have rounded leaves, and they're closely related to each other. Post oak will, in a lot of ways, it has similar features to white oak, except that it doesn't have that shingly appearance and it generally won't exhibit that smooth patch disease, and it'll tend to grow in the pinelands. So you will see white oak in the pinelands, but you won't generally see post oak up outside of the pinelands. So here's a good example of post oak's bark. Thank you to John Hooven. He supplied a lot of the photos that I've used for my pineland species. And he has a much nicer camera than me, so they're pretty fancy looking photos. So thanks to John for them. So what I'm seeing here is an ashy gray, very light colored, and it kind of has a little bit of a darker pockets, fissures. So we see these light gray plateaus or ridges on the tree, and it's vertically oriented. And then these very dark fissures. So it's a pretty high contrast, as opposed to the regular white oak we were looking at a minute ago that had a darker gray here and didn't quite go quite as black. So it wasn't as high contrast between the ridges and the furrows, right? It kind of had a little bit less of a contrast going on than this. So this is a useful ID character to differentiate between white oak and post oak. And again, post oak is not going to show those shingles. It's not really going to form those different bark characters like white oak will. It tends to break up into this vertically oriented blocky texture early on, and then just sort of maintain this through the life of that stem as it gets bigger and bigger. And post oak generally will not get as large as white oak, although they still can get pretty big. Here's a look at the leaves. So again, they're rounded, right? There's no teeth here. Sometimes oak trees will hang on to their leaves into the winter time. So this is a post oak. Again, you can see that light ashy gray. The sunlight is a little tough, I know, to kind of pick out the color really well here. But that was a similar light ashy gray to this one here. And again, you see this one had some leaves on it as well. So if you have some leaves, then you can pick apart the fact that post oak will tend to have a cruciform look. So it has kind of a cross thing going on here. So you might have these smaller lobes down at the bottom, but in general, you'll have these two large lobes opposite each other that are pretty perpendicular to the main direction of the leaf. So they kind of form that cross shape. And then you'll have this last lobe on, past that, forming the top of the cross. So this is a useful ID character if you can get your hands on leaves. If the tree still has some hanging on, then if you see this, it's probably a post oak, especially if you're in the pinelands. Here's a good image of some of the buds. I don't find bud characters to generally be very useful in the wintertime with these oak trees, because I generally can't get my hands on them unless the tree is very young. Here's a comparison between the two. So again, we've got more of like a darker gray on the white oak, still not super dark. And so there's not as high of a contrast between the plateaus and the furrows or the valleys here. Whereas the post oak is almost white to black with that contrast. And also I tend to find that post oak has a little bit less consistency in how the bark breaks up. And you can see that on this tree. So as it becomes more mature, you'll see these areas with wider plateaus or ridges on the bark, and then these areas where it's broken up into more blocky areas. And aside from the smooth patch disorder, if you look at the healthy bark here on this white oak, it's very consistent in the size of those blocks and the general overall texture. And again, here we have that shingly appearance that as the semi-mature stem is breaking up into its final mature bark character, and the same post oak bark here. And the color comparison is really key here, that light ashy gray on the post oak compared to a medium gray on the white oak. All right, now we're going to go into chestnut oak. This is another oak in the white oak subgroup, Quercus montana. Chestnut oak tends to grow very straight. It tends to grow with a central lead all the way up, and it tends to grow in uplands. So all of the oaks we've looked at so far, white oak, post oak, and chestnut oak, tend to be upland adapted species. They tend to not grow where it's very wet. They're not well adapted to wetland environments. One of the oaks that we're not going to cover today, swamp white oak, which would fit into this section of the talk very well, is a wetland species. Obviously, it's called swamp white oak. But as far as the white oaks are concerned, of the ones we're going to cover today, none of them are wetland adapted. They're all upland species. And chestnut oak is the most upland adapted of the three. So this one I would expect to really never find in a wetland area. Now, trees don't read the books that we read. They don't follow the rules, so you might find one. But in general, these are always going to be up in dry areas. They like to grow in rocky areas where there's good drainage and there's not a lot of standing water. And the bark is really the key identification character for me. Once I know that I'm in an upland area and I see the bark, we're going to look at this from a different angle, and you'll really see what I'm talking about here. This bark forms a very triangular or pyramidal type shape. So if I'm that little bug moving across the landscape of the bark, I'm going to kind of go up to the top and then back down again, and then up to the top and then back down again, up to the top. There's never a flat plateau. It's just up and then down, very zigzagged. You zig and then you zag. And if we look at that from below and look up the tree, you can really see that, right? So there's very little in the way of flat plateaus, just a little bit going on here, but for the most part, we're going up and down and up and down. So this to me, and this bark character tends to show itself very early on in the tree's growth. So if we go back here, this stem was maybe 4 inches in diameter, and it's already exhibiting some of that character. And then as we get into a more mature stem, this is more like 10 inches in diameter. We really see it fleshing out here. And this is that same 10-inch diameter stem looking straight up into the canopy. Very, very useful ID character. Here's that young tree. Again, it was like maybe 4 or 5 inches in diameter. And we're kind of seeing a little bit of that texture there as well, especially down here. The buds tend to be very sharp. I don't believe that this one exhibits any hairiness or pubescence, but one of the things that I tend to notice on chestnut oak is this fluting of the twig. So not every oak does this, but it kind of forms this like sinewy sort of, you know, a little bit of a channel in between these like these larger parts that come out here. So I call this fluting, you know, like you'd see on a pillar. Or, you know, like a Roman style column, the fluting that goes up. I tend to see that on chestnut oak twigs. And there's a little bit closer up here. Again, no hairiness, pretty sharp buds. That fluting, pretty just a medium brown. It can be down to gray, but this is generally a good idea of what the color is going to look like. All right, now we're going to get into the black oaks. Okay, so from here on out, the rest of the oaks we're going to cover today are in the black oak group. Pin oak is one of the most common oaks planted on the landscape. It's a very widely distributed oak species. It covers a lot of the country, and so there's a large gene pool, and so there tends to be a lot of variation within the species. So oak trees in general are notorious for being difficult to get down to the species as far as identifying them. We can get to the genus, you know, we can figure out it's an oak pretty easily. But when you're navigating between pin oak and red oak and scarlet oak and black blackjack oak and bear oak, all these oaks that grow in the state that are relative, that have a lot of similarities, without acorns present, it can be really difficult to get down to the species. So I'm going to go over what I use to get to the species on each one of these oaks, with the caveat that, again, these trees don't read the books. They don't follow the rules that we put out to say, you know, this is how you identify the tree. And there's a lot of crossover between these species. And at the end of the oak section, I'm going to have a lot of comparison slides between these oaks, and especially about their bark. So you can kind of pick some of this stuff apart. So if they all start looking the same, just hang in there. We're going to get to a part where we can compare the bark between them. And then I think we're probably going to be going into questions. So here we go. Pin oak tends to grow with a main central lead, but not always. So like here, we see that it maintained its central lead for quite a while, and then it broke up into two. Sometimes it'll break up like that white oak we saw and just form a bunch of scaffold limbs and totally lose its central lead. But sort of one of the standard looks for a pin oak is this jumping jack shape, where we have some branches that grow down, and some branches that grow to the side, and some branches that grow up, just like our arms do when we're doing jumping jacks, right? It has one of the smallest leaves of the black oak group, so it tends to have very, very thin twigs. It tends to have a fine twig texture along the against the winter sky, and we can see that up here, right? Looks like we probably have some pretty small leaves. And pin oak is notorious for hanging on to dead branches, so that doesn't necessarily mean it's not doing well, but pin oak will tend to have a lot of dead wood up in the canopy if it's just growing out in the woods. And that's just because those branches, for whatever reason, maybe they couldn't support themselves anymore, the tree cut them off, and they died and the tree hung onto them. You have one of these on your landscape, you know what I'm talking about. You're picking up branches all year. You got to pay maybe you got to pay a tree service to come out and do a crown cleaning every couple of years because it just hangs on the dead wood. The bark is also one of the smoothest of the black oak group. So for that little bug going around the stem here, we have very little topography, right? The geography of this stem is pretty easy. This is like almost like walking on the sidewalk, right? Pretty smooth. It's still vertically oriented. We can kind of see a vertical texture going on here, and it will get a little coarser as the tree gets more mature, but it tends to form a pretty consistent medium gray color. And if the tree's showing some of these cracks in between the outer bark, this is just exposing a little bit of the inner bark, we'll tend to see kind of a blonde gray or blonde like brown color in between. But generally, we're just going to have a relatively smooth, vertically oriented gray bark. And if we look here, here's where it's starting to cross over and look a little bit more like a red oak, right? So this one is hanging on to a lot of dead wood. Okay, we're seeing all this dead wood on the tree. We're seeing some of those downward growing branches, so that helps us to determine that this is a pin oak. But if we were that bug walking across the landscape of the stem, even though we have some of this light and dark coloring going on here, it's still very smooth, right? We don't have that rolling hills topography like we did in the beginning when I was first going over bark. It's still pretty smooth. And here's another one. This is a young pin oak. And again, vertically oriented, not a whole lot of topography here. We are seeing a little bit of that light and dark going on, but generally just a medium gray, not a whole lot of texture. Okay, I couldn't get a good healthy twig, but this is a dead twig. And you can see how skinny some of these twigs get. This is a close-up under a hand lens. So, you know, this is like maybe an 1/8 inch diameter at the end of the twig here. Oaks tend to cluster buds at the end of the twigs. And you see they're kind of egg-shaped, maybe a little bit less sharp than that Quercus montana that we saw earlier, but generally egg-shaped and pretty similar in that kind of brown color. This is a super useful ID character. Pin oak has very, very small acorns, and the cap tends to only cover maybe about a quarter to a third of the nut. So you have the cap here, and then you have the nut nestled inside of the cap. And on some acorns, we'll also see lines radiating out from the bottom, forming like the spokes of a wheel. Okay, that's pin oak. Northern red oak is next. This is another oak in the black oak group. This one tends to form a bit more vertical texture than the pin oak does. So here's a good example from John Hooven, showing that very light to very dark color. And this is a relatively young stem. This is like maybe 8 inches in diameter. On a mature tree, we're going to see a lot more texture. It's still not anything like some of the other ones we looked at early on in the talk, or like the white oak that we just saw earlier. But it does have what's colloquially referred to as ski trails. So if we look back at this, if we're thinking about this like, you know, like snow on a mountain, that's my timer telling me that I should wrap it up soon. Then when we're looking up into the canopy here, we start to see some of these, what remind me of like ski trails going down a mountain, if we're looking at it from the bottom of the slope, right? And again, we have a relatively smooth topography if we're that little bug walking around the circumference of the stem, but it's definitely got a little bit more rolling hills going on than the pin oak did, right? We can see that especially here. It's still not super thick and coarse, but we definitely have a little bit of this kind of ropey, hilly texture going on here. Again, it's still vertically oriented, not super deep, but we're definitely getting some more texture here than we did on the pin oak. And if we look up, we can see some of that kind of ski trail look going on. Red oak will tend to show this character, this kind of light and dark contrast, much more prevalently on the underside of its scaffold limbs. So these main architectural limbs coming off the main stem, which I call scaffold limbs, you'll tend to see a lot more dark on the bottom than you will on the top. The top will tend to be a lighter gray. The twig is thicker than the pin oak was. The leaves are larger, the buds are larger, similar shape, but they're going to be a little bigger than the pin oaks were. And the acorn is a lot bigger. The acorn can be up to 1 inch in length. The cap tends to cover just the top quarter of the nut here. It doesn't come down very far at all on the nut, and that's a really useful ID character for red oak. Black oak is the next one. So black oak grows very similarly to red oak, whereas pin oak will often maintain that main central lead and not break up into a lot of scaffold limbs, although it can and does often. These tend to always lose their main stem and break up into these scaffold limbs if they have any kind of ability to grow out wide. The main thing I want to mention here about losing the main central lead is that, again, I'm going to repeat this, if trees are growing in competition, if they're close to each other and they're all competing for sunlight, they're going to tend to just grow as tall as they can because they want to get to that sunlight. They don't want to be shaded out by their neighbors because they'll die. So red oak, black oak, pin oak, growing in competition in the woods, they may all maintain one central lead and just have a little tuft of green at the top because they're just trying to get that bit of sun at the top of the canopy. With any kind of space to grow, we'll tend to see them lose that central lead and form more of a scaffold limb architecture to create this canopy. Pin oak is the one that's most likely to maintain that central lead of the three. Black oak and red oak will tend to lose them at the first opportunity. Black oak has larger leaves than red oak, especially in the shade. Black oak can form shade leaves that are as big as my head. Oak trees tend to form much smaller leaves up in the sun than they do way down in the shade. That's true of most species, most trees, but oaks tend to do that to a really exaggerated extent. So we're going to see a similar amount of texture to the red oak, but I tend to see a bit more contrast between the light and the dark. So if we think about it as being, black oak, we're going to tend to see a lot more black in the darker areas here than we did on the red oak. And it tends to form a blocky texture. So it'll be vertically oriented, but as we get into maturity, we start to form these areas that break off from that vertical structure and tend to get this kind of blocky shape to it. And on a mature tree, we're going to see, again, we have this vertical orientation, but as we've gotten to more maturity, we see that we don't have, on the red oak, we had a little bit more distance between the vertical plates, whereas here we just have very tight, kind of blocky structure going on here all around the tree. And here we see it breaking up into those smaller little blocky characters here. Whereas if you remember on that red oak, it had some pretty well connected vertically oriented ridges that had that kind of ropey appearance to them. But again, if we're a little bug walking across the terrain, it's not super deep in between the plateaus. We don't have deep valleys. It's still not very thick bark, but it's got a bit more of a blocky texture and it's got a lot more black in there generally. Okay, this is a mature black oak tree. Twigs are similar to the red oak. I've heard that there's a bud scale character that helps you to differentiate between black and red oak. I don't know it. If somebody knows it, maybe you could put it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Again, it exhibits some of this fluting. This one happens to be a little green because I took this picture during the growing season. But generally, you're going to be brown to gray on this new growth on the twig. Black oak's acorns are similar in size to red oak, maybe just a hair smaller. But the important difference here is that the cap comes farther down, about 1/2 to 2/3 of the way down the nut, like we're seeing here. And the real key, aside from how far down the cap comes, is the fact that the scales on the cap lift at the tip. So if you look here, there's this lifting where they're no longer pressed down, and you can even kind of see it here. They're kind of coming out and forming like a sawtooth pattern here. You can see a little bit there. That is a useful ID character for black oak. So even if you can't find a nut, but you see a cap hanging onto the tree and it's lifting like that, it's probably a black oak tree. Here's our comparison, right? So we got black oak versus red oak. So again, we've got a finer, blockier texture on the mature black oak as opposed to this mature red oak, which tends to have a more vertically oriented, less contrast between light and dark in the colors here, and not nearly as blocky. There's the pin oak versus the red oak. Again, this is mature to mature, very smooth, not a whole lot of this texture. We can have a little bit more of an overlap between these two, where this can be a little smoother, this can have a little bit more texture, but in general, the pin oak is going to be smoother than the red oak. And then here's the pin versus the black. So we're not seeing any of that blockiness on the pin oak. And on the black oak, we're having a lot more of, again, a contrast between light and dark, whereas the pin oak is a pretty uniform gray. On younger stems, black oak tends to form that contrast between light and dark in that finer texture at a young age, whereas red oak will form these kind of fissures that are inconsistent. So we'll see areas that are relatively smooth, maybe have a hint of brown in the gray, and then we'll have these vertically oriented fissures that look like cracks. So this is a really key identification character for me. If I'm looking at a mature tree and this is a scaffold limb up in the sky, I'm looking for that light to dark, blocky contrast look on the black oak. I'm looking for more of the ski trail type, kind of broken up in areas, but then smooth in others on the red oak. And then pin versus red, we're going to see less of that breaking up. We'll still see a little bit of this, but not so starkly. It'll tend to just be sort of a uniform gray, once again, with still some apparent vertical texture. And pin to black, these are very similar. Again, I'm looking at the contrast between light and dark in the black oak. I'm looking at the fact that it tends to break up into this blocky texture a little more. The pin oak tends to be a little smoother. It tends to not have as much of a light to dark. It tends to be a pretty consistent gray color. We're at 8:05. So I want to see, how many questions do we have?
Kieran, I have 14 that are in the Q&A, and there's a couple other comments in the chat that I probably want to cover as well.
So what I'm going to do for now, we know that we left off on blackjack oak. If we have time at the end, maybe I'll go into the birches and I'll skip these last couple oaks. But if I can get my 300 slide presentation to get to the end, then I'm going to leave the presentation here just so that people can look at this list of home practice books, and I'm going to open up the Q&A on my other screen, and we'll see what we got here. So Q&A, Annabelle asked, are white oak shingles usually rectangular? Sometimes I get shagbark hickory bark and older white oak bark mixed up. So the difference between shagbark hickory and white oak bark is in the way that they peel off of the tree. So what am I looking for here? I just take my little weeds book. So white oak bark, if this is the stem of the tree, those white oak shingles will peel this way, right? So they're peeling off from around the circumference horizontally, if we're on like a vertical stem, whereas the hickory is going to peel like this from top and bottom. So hickory bark doesn't generally peel in this direction along the stem. It's going to tend to peel either from the bottom or from the top, and the oak shingles are going to peel in this direction on the stem. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Seth's question was asking for a textbook and field guide recommendations for New Jersey trees, and I have that up now, so there you go. Peg asked, she has an old dawn redwood that stands over 100 feet tall. How would you describe its bark, which to me is almost shreddy? That's exactly how I would describe it. Shreddy, and you said exfoliating. Yeah, I would tend to describe dawn redwood as being vertically oriented, shreddy. It has a lot of red in it compared to the oaks that we've looked at today. Very fine texture, right? It doesn't have big blocks. It tends to have very fine, shreddy look. A little bit of exfoliation. I mean, it's not crazy like a sycamore or a hickory, a shagbark hickory would be, but yeah, some exfoliation. For me, dawn redwood, the key identification character is in the form that it takes, and that fluting. The way that the tree forms those columns going up the main stem, and the armpits, right? Under the branch, you'll have these pockets like an armpit. Very useful ID character for doing redwood. What is the primary role of tree bark? Robert asked. Tree bark offers protection for the vascular tissue. So trees, if they lose that, so most trees, the live tissue that conducts water from the roots up to the leaves and that conducts sugar from the leaves back down to the roots is only in that outer maybe 2 to 10 growth rings. And so the outer rings, the very outer growth rings, are going to have the phloem, which conducts sugar down, generally down, but can also conduct it horizontally or back up, depending on what time of year it is and what the tree needs. And then the xylem is those straws that conduct water up from the roots to the leaves. The xylem tends to have more usable tissue on those outer rings than phloem. You might only have 2 years worth of phloem conducting sugar. You might have 5 years worth of xylem conducting water. But in general, it's just those outer few rings. So the point I'm making here is that all of the things that the tree needs to survive, because it has to have that connection between the roots and the leaves, all of that is on the outer edges of the tree's wood. All of that inner heartwood is dead and has been plugged up with lignin. So the inner wood of a tree is not live tissue. So if the tree has serious mechanical damage, let's say another tree next to it falls and hits the tree and scrapes off a bunch of bark and destroys a bunch of that cambium and that xylem and phloem, that part of the tree is now disconnected between the roots and the leaves. And to some extent, the tree can accommodate for that and redirect its nutrients up and down around those wounds. But the bark needs to be out there to protect that essential conductive tissue because it's all on the outside. None of it in general is occurring on the inside of the tree. Palm trees are different. I'm pretty sure that palm trees have live tissue going all the way through, but regular trees like we see in New Jersey, that's how it works. Christine Hall said, that looks like a red oak at Passion Puddle. You are right, it's on Red Oak Lane. So the red oak, the mature red oak that I took pictures of and the mature black oak were both right next to each other, and they're both growing on Red Oak Lane on the Passion Puddle lawn there. So good eye. I have so many pictures of trees from over there. Kim said, excellent presentation. Thanks, Kim. Richard asked, which oaks are more subject to disease? Broadly, I'm going to say I'm not 100% sure. I know that in general, the red oak, the black oak group tends to be more susceptible to oak wilt and bacterial leaf scorch. I believe that they're more susceptible to both. But the white oaks can get both of those as well. So I would say probably the red oak, the black oak group, which includes red oak, pin oak, and black oak, tend to be more susceptible to disease. You generally don't want to prune, if you're in an area where oak wilt is or may be present, you generally don't want to prune any oak trees during the growing season because you run the risk of introducing the disease. You run the risk of attracting the beetles that introduce the disease. So if you're asking because you want to know whether or not to prune your oaks in the middle of the summer, the answer is probably don't do that regardless of what kind of oak it is. But yeah, I would say probably the oaks in the black oak group with the sharp teeth at the ends of the leaves. John said he used to get thousands of acorns in his yard. Now he hardly gets any. Why is that? Oaks do this thing called mast years where we don't totally know why this is, but we think it's like a cat and mouse game between trees and the animals that eat their seeds. So oak trees produce acorns, and a lot of the native animals in New Jersey love acorns. It's a really useful food source. So what oak trees do is they seem to have years, for whatever reason, where they'll produce tons of acorns. And this could be just 1 year, it could be several years in a row. And then they'll have years or several years where they produce very few acorns. And the idea is that they produced all these acorns. Actually, let's start at the other. We'll start the other way. They had a year where there was a scarcity of food, and a bunch of the predators that eat their seeds died because they could not survive because there wasn't enough food around. And then they produce a ton of seeds, and their predators will increase in numbers, but there's not enough of them to eat all the seeds. Or some of the squirrels will plant a bunch of the seeds because they bury them, right? And they'll forget where they were because they just buried so many, maybe they didn't need to eat them all. So the squirrels will plant some seeds that will grow into trees. But it's kind of this idea where the oak tree has some effect on population dynamics of squirrels and deer and other animals that eat acorns. And so it'll produce a bunch to get those seeds growing, and then it'll produce very few to reduce the number of predators that are eating the seeds. They call that, so a high production year is called a mast year, because mast is another word for like food, like seed, natural seed food, like acorns and hickory nuts and that kind of stuff. Annabelle asked, why are tree leaves usually smaller at the top than at the bottom? So tree leaves that are exposed to a lot of sun are more prone to drying out. So what the tree does is it takes, let's just compare, let's just pretend that we have a pin oak, right? So I'm gonna draw like a pretty bad pin oak leaf here. Don't judge me. But let's just say that we've got a pin oak leaf in the sun, because pin oak is a really good example of a tree that does this. And then we have a pin oak leaf that was growing in the shade. And I'm just gonna kind of, for the sake of not taking too long, I'm just gonna kind of draw a really, really bad shade leaf. So here are my wonderful drawings. So, okay, the shade leaf's really bad, but this is the shade leaf, and this is the sun leaf, okay? And I'm not gonna say left and right because I think it's reversed for me compared to you. So this leaf gets a lot of sun, so it doesn't wanna dry up and die, so it produces less surface area, right? It's got these big sinuses that are limiting the amount of surface area that conducts light and produces, performs photosynthesis. And this also will be thicker. So this leaf will have more of a thicker waxy cuticle, which helps to prevent the leaf from drying out. It makes the leaf more capable of preserving its water resources within the leaf itself. So this added surface area along the edges also means that the leaf cools off more readily when the wind blows, right? Whereas we have this shade leaf that's larger, it has more surface area. So this has, I want to make this clear, this has more edges to radiate heat, to sort of lose heat, right? But it has a lower surface area in this direction. It has more circumference though, right? It has more edges where it can kind of cool off and let off some of that steam, so to speak. Whereas this has a much greater surface area to edge ratio. So this needs to have more surface area because it's in the shade, it's not getting a lot of sun. It's like a, it's like a big umbrella trying to catch as much sun as it can. And it doesn't have as much of a waxy cuticle because it's not so exposed to the hot sun in the middle of the summertime. So it's not as prone to withering away and drying out from being overheated. So the shade leaf will be larger and it'll have more photosynthetic area because it's more protected. It doesn't have as much exposure to the sun, but it also needs more area to catch more of that sunlight to perform photosynthesis. So the tree is investing similar amounts of energy because it's putting a bunch of wax into this leaf to make it sturdier and tougher and more able to survive the harsh conditions up at the top of the canopy. This leaf will be paper thin, it'll be much softer to the touch, and it will so it'll be bigger, but it might not necessarily be a whole lot heavier than this one because it doesn't have as thick of a waxy cuticle. So that's why leaves are smaller at the top than they are at the bottom. Can you briefly speak about timber values of the trees you covered? That is not my forte, Jim. Somebody else, so I am not a forest landowner. I rent an apartment. So I don't really, and I'm not a forester, I'm an arborist, so I don't really deal in timber value. White oak, I believe, is the highest timber value tree that I covered today. And red oak is a pretty good too, I think. But in general, I'm just going to kind of pass on this question because I'm relatively inexperienced with timber value. Maybe somebody else can put something in the chat and we can read it. If somebody else has something good to say, please put it in the chat. And if we have time, we'll answer Jim's question that way. Joyce said she believes she has found a black ash with emerald ash borer in the woods around her community. It is loaded with woodpecker holes. Should she be reporting that to anyone? I mean, so it's in the woods around your community? No, I mean, no. It's emerald ash borers throughout the state. I meant to put in a picture. I got a picture of an ash tree this past weekend that was completely debarked by woodpeckers. Like it had like bark on the bottom foot or two, and then it had no bark up the rest of the tree. Well, I should say it showed only inner bark up the rest of the tree. It had all been pecked away by woodpeckers. It was really crazy. And the ground was just covered in bark. But yeah, no, to my knowledge, nobody at the state or anywhere is asking for people to report ash trees anymore. Now, if that ash tree has targets, so if it's near a walking path, if it's got power lines near it, a structure, a porta-john, if there's any targets around, then yeah, you should probably report that to whoever owns the property. But as far as like regulatory bodies like APHIS or the state DEP, no, there's no reason to report emerald ash borer now. It's throughout the whole state, and we're old news in the emerald ash borer world. Now Texas is the one where people are calling to report. And other like Midwestern states. Lori said, can you say how old a tree is if it has a 4-inch diameter? No, I mean, no. It depends on the species, and it depends on how it was growing and whether or not it was grown in the nursery and given a whole bunch of fertilizer. Could be 5, could be 25. Probably not 100. I don't try to guess tree age because trees will surprise you. Joyce said she lives in Sussex County in Delaware. So Delaware also, I think this was the same. Yeah, so that was the same person who asked the ash question. Delaware, I believe, is the same as New Jersey, but I'm not familiar with Delaware's regulations or what their EAB situation is. I would assume it's the same as ours, but I can't speak to that. So I would look on their, environmental protection website. Lisa asked if I would describe the acorn for white oak. It's more oval, like it's like a stretched out red oak acorn. Yeah, sorry, I didn't have any white oak acorns that I came across, but it's actually on the cover of my field guide to oaks. That's what white oak acorn looks like. It's similar in size to red oak, but it's longer than it is wide, so it's a little bit more oblong than red oak, whereas red oak, tends to be a little bit heavier or around the midsection. So yeah, still probably about an inch long or a little smaller. Ed asked how many participants we had tonight. Do you two know how? We're at 253 right now. Is that around where we have been hovering here?
288 is, I think.
At 7:40, we had 290.
290. Wow, I lost 40 people. Sorry. I guess it wasn't as interesting as last.
There have been some comments in the chat that people had to leave, but they're looking forward to the recording and they're going to, hopefully get their questions answered, either now or later. So yeah,
Hopefully they stayed on at least long enough to see the cat's devil.
really, exactly. The important
that was
part, right?
The highlight of the evening. Jim also asked if I can speak briefly about wildlife value by species. I'm a little bit more familiar with this. White oak and red oak are really important mast species in New Jersey. White oak is the most beloved of the deer. You can go out to the sporting goods store and buy white oak scented like laundry dryer sheets to put in with your hunting clothes. So you try to smell like white oak acorns so the deer will be attracted to you. So white oak and red oak, because of the size of the acorn and those mast ears and the size of the tree, they produce tons of acorns some years. They're very important mast species. To a lesser extent, but still important, basically the rest of the oaks are also important mast species. Acorns are just a really important and valuable food source for our native animals. What else did I talk about today? I talked about oaks. I just talked about oaks. So that's it. Just the oaks. They're all important to some extent.
Kieran, just real quick, Clark just posted in the chat box that he has an answer to the timber prices question. So he has a link to a Penn State site. So I'll add that to our follow-up email that goes out to everybody. Okay.
Great. David said, doesn't a mature black oak tend to drop its branches more than a red oak? I don't know, I guess. The one that I look at as being the one that tends to hang on to its branches, dead branches the most, is pin oak. I think second on that list, as far as most prone to hanging on to dead wood, would be scarlet oak. And then probably red oak, and then black oak. So you're probably right that the black oak will tend to drop its branches earlier, dead branches earlier than red. But I think they're pretty close. But yeah, you're probably right. I'm not totally sure, but I would say that's probably true. So anonymous attendee said, is it a good idea to get a guidebook that mainly features bark for ID? Yes. It's, where's my laser pointer? Bark, that one. It's just called Bark. Right there, yes. That's the one. If you live in New Jersey, I strongly recommend buying this book if you're trying to practice bark ID. This was instrumental in me getting better at IDing trees by their bark. So the answer is resounding yes. Joan said she recently moved from northern New Jersey to South Carolina. Dominant oaks here include live oak, water oak, and laurel oak. Any chance you could recommend a good tree ID book for the Southeast US? Well, this one that I just showed, I don't know if this is in production anymore, though. This is Field Guide to Native Oak Species of Eastern North America. So that's just Eastern, not Northeastern. So that'll include the Carolinas. And this has a ton of oak species in it. But I don't know if this is still in production. I don't even remember where I got this. I think somebody was getting rid of it, or I don't remember. Really useful. And then there's also this one, which is on my list. I don't know where my bark book went. I lost it. Trees of Eastern North America, super useful for like anything that can grow from here to Florida. It has a lot of species that you will not find in New Jersey, but I love this book. I think as long as you're either one of these books, you got to be able to get to oak, or it's not going to work. So you got to know enough to be able to tell it's an oak tree. But if you can get that far, then these books are very useful. Annabelle said one of the trees in their yard is dying. It's a maple. She thinks it's red, a red maple with a lot of lichen on the bark. The available light did not change at all. Why do you think the tree's health started to fail? Also, does increased lichen presence on the bark signify that the tree is in the dying process? To my knowledge, the lichen probably has nothing to do with it. One way or the other, I don't think it either contributed or is a sign that there's a problem. But I don't know. I mean, that's not really a question that I can answer without being present on the property and looking at the surrounding environment. If there was excavation nearby the tree, if something changed with the water supply, if some area nearby was regraded and now the water supply has changed, if you installed sprinklers, if there's a disease, and trees just sometimes get older and get sick and die. So it could have nothing to do with anything. It could just be purely based upon an insect or some other disease that came in and got it. Richard said, deer have rubbed against a couple of young trees with 1-inch stems. Can the tree recover from the rubbed off bark? Yeah, that's tough. Deer will do some serious damage to young trees, especially those like whip size 1 to 2-inch diameter trees. I mean, a deer can literally snap it in half, rubbing their antlers against it. So the tree might be able to recover. Yeah. And it actually might be able to fully recover because it's so young that it might be able to just get over that. But if the trees are important to you, you might want to put some kind of fencing around them to help protect them from deer rub because they can snap them in half. Judy said she has trouble separating larch from dawn redwood. Me too. Other than the armpits on dawns, are there other characteristics that will help with ID? Yeah, the cones are different. Larch cones look more like a standard pine cone, and then dawn redwood cones have a little bit more of like a soccer ball look, if I remember right. The general, so also the way that the needles are oriented. So dawn redwood puts out needles kind of opposite each other going down the twig, whereas larch will produce a short shoot, and then at the end it'll have whorled needles coming out in all directions. So you'll see these like little short shoots going all around the tree like you see on ginkgo. That's really hard to describe. I'm sorry, I don't have like something better for that, but pay more attention to the way that the leaves are oriented. Google search some images of the twig on a dawn redwood versus a larch, and you'll see that larch tends to produce these whorled leaves. So in the wintertime, you'll see evidence of whorled needles as opposed to a dawn redwood where you'll see buds opposite each other going down the stem, but you won't see those short shoots where a bunch of needles are going to come out in a big circle, like the spokes of a wheel. Annabelle said, what in the trees system dictates the bark orientation? And she said, thanks as well. Thanks. I don't know that one, what dictates the bark orientation. There's a lot of like variation between species as far as those xylem and the phloem and the conductive tissue. It's downstairs on my coffee table, but I have a book that's all about like the wood, just like the xylem and the phloem and how those different conductive tissues look on a microscopic scale, and how wood is different between different species, because it's not just that you don't just have xylem and phloem. You have different types of tube cells depending on the species. You have some that are ring porous as opposed to diffuse porous depending on the species, and that isn't necessarily like an ID character between like oaks versus maples, because some maples are more ring porous and some are more diffuse porous. So like, and that has an effect on the bark, I think. So I think that's a really complicated answer that I do not have. That would probably be its own talk, and I've never tried to answer that question. It's a great question though, and I wish that I could answer it. Lisa asked, which oaks keep their leaves over winter? In general, the ones that are most prone to keeping their leaves over the winter, which is called marcescence, are pin oak, white oak, scarlet oak, blackjack oak, post oak, and bear oak or mountain oak. To a lesser extent, you might see that on any of the other oaks. But those are the ones to me that tend to be the most marcescent, with pin and scarlet and white probably being the most marcescent. I would say that white oak will lose more leaves over the course of the winter, as opposed to a pin oak might be a little bit more able to hang on to those dead leaves through the winter because they're smaller and they don't catch as much wind. But that's my list. Joan says, since moving to South Carolina, she learned that palm trees are actually in the grass family. That's correct. Poaceae. They are very big grass. Marge asked, are all these native? Yes. Every species I went through today is native to New Jersey. Christina said, fantastic presentation. Thanks, Christina. Where can landowners learn about grant funding to plant native trees in their woods? I suggest that you become a member of NJFA and keep plugged into our notifications, because that is exactly the kind of stuff that we go over in other talks. So get involved with New Jersey Forestry Association. That's my answer to that question. Peg said she has numerous shagbark and has been told by people at the DNR Greenway that little brown bats sometimes nest under the lifted parts of the bark. Have you seen this? I have heard that. I have not seen it. I'm always looking for little brown bats, and I have never seen one. But I think that they're just really good at hiding under there. I don't think it's me, or I don't think it's them. I think it's me. Doug said, once he identifies an oak, like a pin oak, will there typically be other pin oaks nearby to look for? Yeah, yep. Generally speaking, if you can find one, you'll find more if you're in the woods. It's hard for a tree to arrive somewhere without a parent tree nearby. There are exceptions. Squirrels will take an acorn and run away with it and then plant it somewhere else. So oak trees can show up. And I found an English oak in the Rutgers Eco Preserve, like a young one that definitely was not like planted by a person. And I knew there was an English oak on campus, like way away from there. And so a squirrel must have carried that acorn over there. It was, you'll find that. But generally speaking, you're probably going to find parent trees in the area. Someone asked, which one has deeper roots or surface roots? Of the oaks that I just went over, I'm not really sure. I would say, I don't know. I don't know which ones are deeper or more shallowly rooted. It probably depends upon the water table, but I don't know from species to species from what I've covered. Lori said, timber value varies greatly depending on the new housing market and if it is popular to use wood for flooring or furniture anymore. During the financial crisis after Hurricane Sandy, you couldn't give your timber away. It's still hard to find people that take timber in New Jersey. We just don't have a very big timber industry. You kind of got to be able to produce a truckload to have anybody willing to take it. Susan said she has a large, she thinks it's a black oak tree. Trunk is 6 feet plus in diameter. Nice. It has a few dead branches at the top. She was going to have pruned, but she noticed that it has a few black streaks that look like the trunk is bleeding about 8 foot off the ground. Is it beyond saving in your opinion? Has decent leaf canopy still. So my recommendation, first of all, is to not prune it during the growing season. Prune it during the winter. Use a licensed tree expert company, like a legitimate licensed operation in New Jersey. And what you've got there is probably some form of Phytophthora, a fungal canker, that's causing those weeping wounds. It could be something else. There are a number of fungal canker diseases that can cause oaks to weep like that. My recommendation would be to bring in a plant healthcare company that does systemic fungicides and those types of treatments for trees, like a tree doctor. Again, somebody who's a licensed tree care company, and have them inspect it, because it's probably treatable. But on a mature tree, you don't want to let a canker get too bad, because that will destroy that conductive cambium and eventually girdle the tree. So if you can treat it now, it might be pretty costly, because a lot of these trees are treated by diameter inch, and that's a 6 foot tree. But it's worth considering. It's worth getting somebody out there if you like the tree. That's a big tree. So that's my recommendation. It's probably treatable. I think there's like a phosphorus treatment or something. I'm not sure. It's been a while since I was involved with that, but it's probably treatable. Peg asked, do we care to mention the trees that have patches of pale brown and white coloration that sometimes look crackly and peels off, such as London plane or understory trees like Strax? I think maybe she meant Styrax. I'm not sure about that one, but yeah, I'm not really going to talk about those today. I don't ever include shagbark, hickory, or American sycamore in these tree ID presentations because, in my opinion, once you learn that one, like, you got it. And it's relatively easy to learn how to identify those trees. So I'm already bad enough at getting through my slides. So I don't really get into those, but yes, they are beautiful. I love driving down along the Delaware River and seeing all this American sycamore trees looking like skeletons standing up along the river. Declan said, apart from open U-shaped sinuses as opposed to closed U sinuses on pin oak and scarlet oak respectively, are there any other ways to identify the difference between them? Yeah, the acorn. Scarlet and pin are super similar, and in the wintertime, it is incredibly difficult to tell them apart, in my opinion. I think that scarlet oak tends to have slightly darker bark, but there's so much overlap between the two that it can be difficult to really use that practically in the field. So the best I can say is if you can get an acorn, scarlet oak acorns are significantly larger than pin oak acorns. And they have, the cap covers, I believe, about 2/3 of the nut, whereas on a pin oak, yeah, I think scarlet's half to 2/3, and pin oak is only that top 1/4 to 1/3. So the pin oak's just wearing it on the top of its head, and the scarlet oak's got it down over its ears. Rachel asked, why is the stump always have more density than the upper trunk? There are some exceptions to that, but yeah, in general, the stump is going to be the widest part of the tree, and that's because that is the oldest part of the tree. So for those of you who don't know, trees do not push themselves up out of the ground. Some people think that trees grow up out of the ground. So the way that a tree grows is every year the stem that's at this height will stay here, but it'll put on another layer of wood. And then the following year, it'll put on another layer of wood, and then it'll get wider and wider. And the way that it grows taller is it has a bud, and that bud produces a shoot or a fresh new twig in the springtime, and that grows up and produces more height. And then that will stay there and produce more width and grow wider. So trees grow out from the tips, and they grow wider in diameter around the circumference. So that's why the stump is the biggest part, because it's the oldest part. It's got the most growth rings, and so it's got the widest diameter. We're getting close to being very over time. We're somewhat over time now. I'm going to keep going until people tell me to stop. It's not like I'm going anywhere. It's COVID. Christopher said, why do gypsy moths have such an appetite for oaks? I don't know what their native ecology is, where they come from. But my guess is that they probably feed on oaks in their native range. And so they really like our oaks because our oaks don't have as much defense against them. That's just generally how invasives work. But I don't know really totally for gypsy moth what the answer is. Ed said, thanks, Kieran. Interesting and informative. Thanks, Ed. John said he missed the first presentation. Is there any way he can get a recording? Yes. Yes, there is. Lori's answering your question in the chat right now.
Yep.
Someone said, which oaks are most favorable for birds and insects? That is another great question. My recommendation is to read Doug Talamy's work. He goes over that in great detail. I'm not a super expert on that. I'm increasing my own knowledge in that area right now, but I think Lori's going to give you the book or some recommendations on that. In the chat, Darren said timber prices vary by season. Thank you for that. Judy said, which species are most likely to self-prune and drop dead wood? I mean, all species do that to some extent as far as I know. But the ones I guess of the oaks that we covered today, it would be the opposite of what I said earlier as far as the ones that are hanging on to dead wood. Peter said, thank you. Is that a department in the NJDEP? I'm not sure what you mean by that, Peter. And Peter also asked, will live oaks grow or thrive in New Jersey? Live oak has to be protected in the winter if you want to grow it in New Jersey. So the answer to that, simple answer to that is no. They don't like how cold it gets here. If you have a nice protected area away from the wind, you might be able to get it to grow, but I don't think it'll ever grow to the stature that you see down in the Carolinas or something. It's just not adapted to the cold here. Susan said she posted the links in the description. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it looks like she spread the word about the Tree ID webinar. Thank you so much. I appreciate everybody who was on last month and spread the word and how enthusiastic everybody is. I love doing this, and as you can see, I have an essentially infinite amount of slides. What is the lifespan of oaks? Terry asked. I think white oak is like 500 years or something, 400 or 500 years, generally around 250. It varies for the other species. White oak, I think, is the most long-lived of the native oaks. So they're all going to be like 200 or less. The ones in the pinelands will generally be much less, like 100 or like 80, I think. Don't quote me on any of those numbers. I would check online, or in a guidebook about that. I haven't needed to know that for a long time, so I've forgotten it. Cora asked, are there any good apps that you know of for Tree ID? I believe the answer to that is yes, that there are good apps, but the answer overall is no, because I don't know them. I've heard like Leaf Snap, and there's a, I'm not sure.
We had Andy, what presentation did we do? Was it Pam Zipsi's on urban and community forestry?
Yes,
that she had those students, right? That actually looked at the different apps and kind of rated them. So if you're interested in those kinds of things, send me an email and I can pull up that presentation. You'll have to watch the whole presentation, but it's in there. So, and it's a great presentation, by the way, too. So just send me an email.
Peg said, please try getting a copy of Native Trees for North America by Guy Sternberg and with Jim Wilson. It's expensive but outstanding. Bark may be out of print. Oh, that's terrible news. It's not? Okay.
No, I just got a copy right from the author, Mike, I forget it, Wojciech, I think his name. Yeah, you go to his website. I'll pull that up, and he will send you a copy. Hold on a second, I'm trying to get it up on. Apparently, you can get it on Amazon too.
I got it on Amazon.
Yeah, but he has a website. It's really cool, with some good information. So knowyourtrees.com. Let me see if that's it.
Oh.
Yes, knowyourtrees.com is Michael Wojciech's website, and it's where you can purchase that book. And heads up, I asked for an autographed copy and got it.
That's pretty awesome.
Oh, I'm pretty excited about that.
So Robert asked, does bark split naturally as a tree grows? The answer is yes. If the species naturally has bark splitting like that, then yes, it's natural. Judy asked, do you have a favorite bark aesthetically? This goes into last month's question. It's the same tree, probably. I would say, well, you know what? I love river birch bark. I'm a pretty big fan of river birch bark. I love how different it is across the tree, from the young stems all the way down to the mature stems. It's pretty cool. But I also love Kentucky coffee tree bark, which is the answer to last month's what's your favorite winter tree. Peg said, no, Dawn redwood cones are very, very small. Don't tell anybody when nobody's looking. I like to hug my monster tree. I'm sorry I told everybody. But I have hugged many thousands of trees while measuring their diameter. So many, many thousands. She invites me to take pictures. Thanks. Richard said, someone tied a rope to the horizontal branch of an oak to make a swing. Is this something to be concerned about? Over time, that rope will wear into the cambium of that branch. You're better off using like a flat webbing that's rated for, human weight use, like, that's rated for climbing or something. And just know that anything that you tie up in a tree and leave out in the sun is going to degrade over time and need to be replaced. So not only should you replace it because the tree needs you to move it so that you don't wear and kill that spot. You need to move it down the stem to keep from wearing too heavy on that one part of the stem, but you also need to replace it so that you don't fall off of it, because it will eventually degrade in the sunlight and break. So, be safe out there. Fred said, will a weed killer like Roundup harm a mature tree that is covered with poison ivy? My recommendation is to use a cut surface application. So something where you're not spraying the live leaves, the green leaves, like you would with standard Roundup. There are products that contain glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, or there's like Garlon, which is a different active ingredient that you can get in formulations for treating cut surfaces. So you would cut the stem and then paint the herbicide only onto the cut surface, and that would go into the roots and kill the roots. That's my recommendation for a situation like that. Not all of those are going to be available to you as a consumer. Some of them you may have to hire a licensed pesticide or herbicide applicator for that. Albert asked, when is Tree ID Part 3 coming? Maybe soon, I don't know. And somebody said, last question, as a shade tree volunteer, we look at trees from homeowners who are afraid the trees may be dead. Do we have to wait until the leaves come out to determine? We always thought that bark missing would be an indication, but not so sure now. So the answer is you can definitely tell if a tree is alive in the winter, but you have to have some kind of experience. I mean, it took by the time I was out in the field performing tree inspections, I was just starting to get comfortable with being able to tell whether a tree was dead or alive in the winter. And then I had to learn how to tell whether or not it was like how healthy it was. And you can tell all of that in the winter, but it takes a lot of practice. It takes a good eye, because you have to be able to see buds up in the canopy. The main things that I look for are live buds. So twigs, when they die, the first thing that they lose in the winter is the buds. So generally, the first thing I look for is buds to see if there's a twig up there that has no buds on it, it's almost certainly dead. And you can tell that in the wintertime if you can see the buds on the twigs. So if the twigs are 60 feet in the air, you have to have some pretty good eyes or a pair of binoculars. But that's that, and like the shininess of the twigs, because they tend to lose a lot of their shine because that waxy cuticle degrades more when they're dead. And I think there are other reasons why dead branches look more dull. It gets pretty complicated, and it takes some practice. But the short answer is it's possible, but it's going to take some practice. And that is it as far as the questions in the Q&A. And you're muted, Lori.
Okay, thank you, Kieran. So thank you. Just a couple things that I could go on for another hour with all the comments and stuff in the chat. We're going to try to adjust them, hopefully within a follow-up email. But real quick, Susan is saying that the picture this is the best app according to the talk that we had with Pam. So picture this is a Tree ID app that got pretty rave reviews. Let's see. The other thing is that Doug wants to know if any field trips are planned on tree IDs in either Central or North Jersey. That is something the board talked about, obviously depending on the safetiness of it. So you'll obviously get emails if it's something we decide to do. And then I have to just mention that Susan also wants to know if we can have another tree ID, including birch. And there were a lot of other people that wanted certain other different types of trees. So
Birch was
Just
next,
going to
and
end with
my
that. Birch was
my birch
next.
my birch section is very. I was very excited to show that today. I'm disappointed that I didn't get there, but yeah, if we decide to do another tree ID talk, we're going to start with birch. Okay, that's my promise to you.
I think
So.
that's good. All
Yeah,
right.
one time we do tree ID is also at the Woodland Stewards Program, which unfortunately we have not been able to do. 2020 we didn't do it. We don't know for 2021 yet whether we're going to be able to do it. But Kieran also does that. Does the up at the Camp Linwood McDonald. Kieran does the tree ID up there as well, and that's a walk through the woods. Kieran's also done it at Duke Farms, but again, a lot depends on when we can get out without endangering anybody.
Yeah, Duke Farms was great for doing tree ID. That was, I mean, and so is the Frelinghuysen Arboretum in Morristown. But yeah, this is what my birch slides will look like if we ever get to them. So stay tuned. Become a member of New Jersey Forestry Association. Get your updates, and then you will never miss out on another tree ID presentation, or you'll know when the Woodland Stewards Program is coming up, and that is a delightful trip. And I hope we get to do it this year. I'm not counting on anything yet. A lot of questions still, but eventually we'll do it again.
I think that's a wrap.
Yeah. I think that's it. We've lost almost all of our oh wait, we still have 147? No, that can't be.
Still good luck. Yeah.
Yeah, we
Wow.
do.
They're dropping. We're getting down there, but
Don't y'all have somewhere to go or something to do or something? Just kidding.
Most people are saying this is the best way to spend their evening, Kieran. So
yeah, I had fun. I'm glad you all did too. Thank you.
yeah,
So.
it's been great. So yeah, again, we'll be doing backyard forestry again every month, the third Thursday. So if you get our emails, we'll certainly keep you informed on that and other programs and events during the rest of this year. So Andy, any parting words
well, the
before
annual
we
meeting
sign off?
from members only was going to be on March 20th. It's a Saturday. It'll be in the morning. And we've got some good presentations for that as well. So, but you have to be a member of the Forestry Association for that. So if you want to take part in the annual meeting, join the association.
Sounds great. Okay. Well, I hope everybody had a great
or
evening.
join anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Or join anyway. Yeah. There you go. It's help support programs like this and other things. So it's definitely worth it. So, all right. Well, thank you. Thank you for participating. Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, Andy. And we hope to see you again soon.
Okay.
Thanks,
Good night,
everyone.
everybody.
All right. Good evening.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.